Hi, everyone. As you can tell from the many times you've seen me during the video in the breaks, I am really excited to be back for my fourth convening. It's nice to be here and to continue the work that we started on fraud risk management almost a year ago now. I'm going to be taking you through something that we are in particular very excited about, and that's a proof of concept. The past 9 months and the 3 convenings that we attended in the past was to prepare us for this step coming up, and that's to start doing some real tangible development and to put together a solution that we could use to partner with the Mojaloop platform to detect fraud within the ecosystem. We're very excited to be able to share this with you, and this is the work that we're going to be doing over the next 3 months. So traditionally, we would come to a convening and tell you about everything that we had done, not necessarily everything that we are going to do, but we had put a lot of planning into this, and this formed quite a bit of the body of work that we did over the last 3 months as well. So it's my great privilege to share this with you. As soon as I get my screen to move, there we go. So just a little bit of background and an overview of the solution in context. So you have your customers who would then transact through the DFSPs, and that could either be through the agent network or a kind of a wallet that is hosted by the financial services provider. The switching hub then handles the interoperability between the DFSPs and the ledgers and the setup for all of the various transactions. So in addition to that, what we want to put forward is a data interface that will transport information into a fraud risk management system where you can do transaction monitoring, where you can do your block list management, and then monitoring those transactions and potentially also customer information. You could do fraud risk detection. You could do money laundering and financing of terrorist detection. And beyond that, you want to give people the ability to manage the alerts that the system generates through a case management and a workflow platform. This is a diagram that many of you will be familiar with, and you would have seen it many times in the past. So this is an example of a Mojaloop implementation with the fraud risk management system attached to the back end of that implementation. You would have a number of different kinds of DFSPs, maybe traditional banks, mobile operators, and you would have a number of different end users, being Adebisi on the bottom left there and Ibaba on the bottom right, a shop or a merchant potentially, and all of these people would use the Mojaloop hub to interact. So Adebisi would get paid her wages by her employer as a major hotel, and she would then use her wages that she receives on her cell phone to buy some groceries at a shop. And then also she uses it to send money to her father in Benin. Every transaction that goes through the Mojaloop network should then be evaluated for fraud. And we've had a look in the past at a number of different configurations and options here. And we agreed, I think in principle at least, that there would be a need for both the Mojaloop hub to implement a fraud risk management solution to catch the fraud and the money laundering behavior on a much wider scale than you would see at a single DFSP. But there would certainly have to be collaboration between the DFSPs and the hub operator, because not all of the transactions currently go through the hub. The DFSP still own some of their own transactions, especially the honest transactions. And there's also some point-to-point agreements that are still in place between DFSPs, so those transactions are invisible to the hub. So there would certainly have to be collaboration between all entities to make sure that the ecosystem is safe and secure at large. I'm also very excited to tell you that we finally have our own GitHub repository. I'm actually very sad that this isn't a live show, because I expect that there might be some applause at this point, because it's taken us some time to join the GitHub. And yeah, thank you, Sudhir. And it's actually nice for us to be able to put all of our user stories, our epics, our plans out in the public eye so that people can see them. You can see the address at the top there. And if you are a member of the Mojaloop community and you would like to participate in the work that we are doing, you're more than welcome to add new issues. You can see that there's a new issues column on the Kanban board. We would definitely love to hear from the community about some of the requirements that they have that we may have missed. And I think this is a great opportunity for people to pitch in and add their 2 cents to the Kanban board. You'll also see that we have logged a large number of user stories and epics so far already. I think we're up in a number of 80s. So if you want to comment on any of those, if you have some thoughts about our acceptance criteria or the user story itself or the scope of the work that we're doing, feel free to leave us a comment. And you can always pitch in on the Fraud and AML channel on Slack if you want us to respond directly to any of your questions or queries. The epic that we are going to be using for our PI now can be summarized as demonstrate the feasibility of a Moduloop fraud risk management solution using only open source components. So that's quite an ambitious target. This isn't something that anybody else has ever done, composing a solution like this exclusively out of open source components. And Greg will be taking us through what we think those components in that architecture might look like for the POC and then beyond as we move into hopefully a minimum viable product on the other side of the POC. Essentially what we are trying to deliver with the POC is to illustrate the data interface, to be able to take on transactions out of a Moduloop system at pace, not compromising the inherent performance targets of the Moduloop system itself, and then to monitor each of those transactions through a rules engine to evaluate the transactions and the customers who participate in those transactions against specific block lists. And that would almost be a real-time interdicting kind of evaluation. So essentially, if somebody is on a block list and you have decided that that person should not be able to transact through the network, then you have the opportunity here to block those transactions outright. Then there's a fraud risk detection. So some of those fraud typologies may be detected in real time, so in the flow, and would return a result before the transaction concludes on its way. This is not necessarily something that we want to do in the Moduloop environment. We've always agreed that the Moduloop environment would complete their transactions in a non-interdicting way. So even if we do detect a risk of fraud in a transaction, we are going to notify and alert on that transaction and perhaps add that client to a block list for future transactions, but we're not going to block that specific transaction. That is in line with the level 1 principles on top of which Moduloop was constructed. But we do offer the capability, and we want to test that in the POC, to be able to do those real-time, potentially interdicting kind of evaluations in the flow. And then on top of that, obviously, we're doing near real-time. Near real-time is also very suitable for AML and CFT, where you are typically for those kind of transactions evaluating a large number of historical transactions as part of the typology to be able to see the behavior on a larger scale or a wider time period. The one thing that we're not doing for this, and Greg will take you a little bit through our thinking around that as well, but we are not going to be doing a specific case management POC. Case management is a fairly well-trod and well-mature technology in open source. We don't think that there's necessarily much value in doing that as part of the POC when we can focus on a large number of the other components. And it also leaves the door open for additional innovation on top of the technology stack that we're building. We are going to at least implement a API ingress and egress from a case management point of view, but not the user interface and the tool to evaluate the cases and the alerts. This is in our very first deliverable back in January. We delivered a business requirements document, and out of that document, we had lifted a number of features that we would like to see in a Moduloop fraud risk management platform. In particular, the features would support or be delivered through a minimum viable product that would then be taken to market. So what we have done for the POC was to go through all of the features that we had identified in the original business requirements document and then break them into the ones that would be great for us to show off in the POC to illustrate that the technology is working. And then after that, an additional set of features for the MVP, and beyond that, we'll see what happens. So there are always some features that will be prioritized down the line. So if you look at our diagram here, the greens are our POC features, the blues are our MVP features, and the yellows are our post-MVP and further down the line features. I'm going to very quickly take you through these. I don't want to delve on them too much, but you can always go and see the detail behind all of these features in our GitHub repository. I did tell you about a GitHub repository that we're really excited about. It's on the MojoLoop GitHub, and you can go and look at fraud risk management in our own repository on GitHub. We want to be able to build the solution using an ISO 20022 interface, and that would also then require a adapter if the client system, being MojoLoop in this case, is not compliant with the ISO 20022 specification or a standard. Those two items are for the MVP, not for the POC. For the POC, we have decided to apply a little bit more direct control over the data flow as we take it into the system, so that we can spare ourselves some of the things that you should really be able to take for granted with the system. So in this case, we want to be able to take the transaction and the customer data in through the system. As you may well know, customer data is not yet part of the MojoLoop API at large, not at the level of the kind of data that we would typically want to be able to collect for fraud risk management purposes, in particular around money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism. So we would want to build a simulated data input stream that adds some of that additional information into the stream so that we could use that to evaluate the typologies that we have picked for the POC. In the long run, we would want to include an extensible data schema, both to facilitate the typologies as they evolve. So more typologies need more data or different kinds of data. You would want to be able to extend the data schema without completely having to rebuild your system. And for another purpose as well is if you want to be able to implement in a different client environment, then you should be able to adapt your data schema to that environment with ease. Again, because we are controlling the data flow and the data that we're taking on, we're not going to do the routines for standardization, validation, and cleansing. We control that data, and we'll make sure that the data conforms at the time that we take it on. But when we get to an MVP, you would certainly want to build those processes into the data flow. It is an essential part of the data or the solution as we go forward. We do want to illustrate that you're able to transform the data, and we also want to illustrate that you're able to enrich the data. So an additional separate source of data that is not your transactional data would then be used to augment the data stream. That may be some additional customer data that we have decided not to collect through the main API. From a data quality management perspective, data quality dashboards is something that we've moved downstream, so we'll be looking at that after the initial MVP. But in the MVP, we certainly want to be able to reject records that do not fulfill the minimum criteria of a record that is for evaluation purposes. And that record will then be going back either to the hub or to the DFSP itself. Real-time entity resolution is almost a foundational component of the system. You may be familiar with the concept of tokenized identification. So to a certain degree, this is what that aims to achieve. But it also aims to uniquely identify a customer across all of our DFSPs and using all of the data that we have at our disposal. So the holy grail of this activity for us would be able to identify the same customer who's applied at one DFSP using a library card, at a different DFSP using a passport, and at a third DFSP using a national ID card. If we can identify that person as the same person within the system across all of those three DFSPs, then I think we are able to do real-time entity resolution. Source data preservation for us. So when you build a system like this, you want full data provenance. You want to be able to map out every change that you have made to the data, every interaction that you have done, every transformation that you have done. And all of that information together will also require you to store the data as you collected it in the first place, and then keep track of all of the changes to that data over time. This allows you to achieve some level of replayability. So if you are rebuilding some rules, or you're doing some regression testing, or if you want to be able to walk through a transaction to make sure that the transaction has been flagged correctly, you would need to record the original data in its original format before you have done any transformation to it. The data preparation UI is an advanced data transformation builder that we want to be able to include, but that's an item for the MVP or beyond. It is a feature that we want to add to be able to make the system more usable and user-friendly by perhaps non-technical staff. On a storage and utilization side of the data pipeline, we want to be able to handle data anonymization and pseudonymization. This is for two purposes. One is around the tokenized ID, but then also to enable privacy rights management, so that somebody who does access your data within the system isn't able to unpack who the data necessarily relates to. And that also goes hand in hand with data encryption, which we intend to bake into the solution from the start at the POC. So anonymization and pseudonymization will be in the MVP, but the data encryption will certainly be the focus of the POC as well. We are planning to store the transactional data we collect, any customer data that we collect, and then also historical data, because we want to be able to illustrate some of the typologies that rely not on the evaluation only of the transaction that we're currently looking at or that is currently traversing the system, but also typologies that rely on the interpretation of that historical data and to build up a pattern of behavior for a specific customer. We're not going to do rules engine results at this point. So, and for the MVP, we want to be able to also include the outcomes of all of the rules engine results, but that won't be the focus of the POC. And similarly, binary documents, so those are all of the attachments, scanned documents, or uploaded documents that you want to be able to add to the system, either to strengthen the investigation that you're doing, or either as related information as part of the evaluation. That will be a MVP feature, not a POC feature. Utilization seems fairly obvious, but we do want to achieve real-time recall of the data that we have in the system should we need it for any rules evaluation. And then the rules processing is essentially the bulk of the utilization, and I'll be taking you through the features that we envisage for rules processing in a second. Disposal. Our architect felt that it would be essential for us to at least consider disposal upfront. Very often, disposal in a new solution is only considered about 2 weeks before you have to start disposing of your first customer records. And we want to avoid getting into that situation and build that into the solution architecture right from the start, which is why purging the archive data is green going into blue. But the others are the functions and the processes around the actual archiving and the historical data processing will be for the MVP. So we're definitely going to look at that from a POC point of view, but we won't implement or mature that feature until we have gotten to the MVP.
Justice, before you move on to the next slide, you've indicated that source data preservation is important for certain kinds of forensic use cases. I'm going to point out possibly the obvious, which is source data preservation prior to anonymization or pseudonymization is extremely dangerous, like way past extremely dangerous. It's like standing inside of the reactor room, dangerous. So I'm going to question that. I don't think you have a need necessarily to maintain the raw data for any purpose. And I would say the GDPR concerns that flow around that, unless this system were being run directly by a regulator and they had the right to hold that data for some retention period, I would have said that the commercial rights to do that are probably not executable. So I'd be very careful about relying upon that in any of the forward build.
Miller, we've actually identified this as a swampy area that critically has to be figured out.
Fair enough. I mean,
yeah, it's an issue. On one hand, you need to have the forensic data, you know, and then the question is, what is the forensic data? You know, in the U.S., a lot of it is what has been maintained and is still available to a certain quality. Yet in some places, it's still, do you have the paper document? So this is kind of all over the place, and we're going to have to be flexible with it and try to figure out the best way through it.
Well, I think that's the important thing, is to recognize that we don't have a reason to go back to that data, but that reason may be placed on us or about an implementer. And so if we say, no, we have a reason to go back to the data, then I question the design, because we shouldn't be relying upon raw, you know, fully ID'd source data in order to make these choices. Patterns of fraud are going to be conducted, and they'll make very clear that they have already anonymized themselves before they put themselves in the system and place themselves under that kind of scrutiny. So we're placing a lot of very innocent people at risk and their data at risk if we take on this this storage capacity. Now, we may be forced to do it by a regulator, but there may be then a whole set of designs around meeting a particular regulatory use case that really doesn't have anything to do with the data pipeline itself. So if you're thinking about making sure you're only operating on anonymized and or pseudonymized data, then you're not placing dependencies then on that source data that are active to the system. That's my only caution.
Yeah, and what needs to be maintained may have in fact been archived, if you will, if it passed through the system, may have been archived off to an appropriate, I don't know, something in isolation to take care of the regulatory requirement. So yeah, there's this area is going to require a lot of focus.
Yeah, so source data preservation could in fact be direct archive. There is no pipeline impact to that. It's literally directly archived in source form in some secure offsite place, and it's not queryable. It has to be brought forward manually if it's required. Fair enough. I just wanted to put a spotlight on that that concern. The other question I have for you guys is, you're starting with the assumption that you're going to use what you call an ISO 20022 interface, but oddly, there's no such thing. ISO 20022 is a schema that describes the compliance of sets of XML messages or JSON or ASN1 messages, and it defines a data dictionary. In particular, there's a set of message catalogs that are created to store suites of messages that are useful in certain applications. We don't have any. We're still trying to figure out if someone required the use of messaging us as a hub using an ISO 20022 message set, how would we extract the information we want, process it, and then return an answer in an ISO compliant message? But that the specific messages we've been looking at for that probably don't have any forensic value. I'm not sure. So I'm trying to understand why choose that. Why not actually say, actually the FRMS data pipeline is on a canonical data that's known to the hub, regardless of how it arrived. This seems to be taking a sort of external view of that, and I'm not sure I understand the reason for that.
The external view of it was basically to pick a standard more as a data schema standpoint that it appears everybody is trying to adhere to. And so that way the FRM solution isn't purely connected to Mojaloop or specific to Mojaloop. It can work with other systems. It's one of the things I'll talk about, was one of the goals that we had in mind. So maybe interface is the wrong choice of word there, but the intention was to closely follow the data dictionaries that are basically involved, and to what level we've only just started mapping stuff like that. But we obviously need to conform to what Mojaloop needs as well. The assumption should be that we should be able to do that. So that's basically it. Miller would love to hear your opinion on that, but the goal was just to try to pick some sort of standard schema as a starting point and go with it.
Okay, I guess without delaying your presentation further, I'd make the final point that Mojaloop doesn't traffic in ISO internally, and so as an appropriate component of the Mojaloop system, we should be looking at a canonical data set, and that canonical data should of course have mappings to the appropriate external interfaces, but the most important one for us is the OpenDFS API. The OpenDFS API is the one used by the mobile money operators, and it is the initial design point for Mojaloop. Conformance to that data dictionary, of course, would be a requirement for anything that we built as a component for the system. But that said, I think then quickly you say, yeah, but what about 8583 and what about 20022? And you suddenly start collecting all these different data sources, and it may be that it's appropriate to have a canonical form, or it may be, to your point, to say, yeah, actually you're going to lose data if you try to map. And so maybe you need to have multiple ways the data enters the system with sensitivity to the form it came from. I'm going to leave that as a study for the POC, but it seems to me you're not even going to really face that till you get to the MVP anyway. That's a blue item here. And the payment platform adapter as well. So I would have said, for the purposes of POC, it would be my plea that you work from the data dictionary defined in the OpenDFS API, with an understanding that we're kicking a can a bit here. but that that'll be something we have to face probably more broadly than simply within FRMS.
Yeah, duly noted. We know we're going to have to figure out how to cater to multiple things.
And Michael says, by the way, that ISO doesn't yet have a JSON mapping. I think it actually does, but it's not official. I think somebody tried it. Maybe it was just a wag who said, I don't like XML. Let me see if I could do JSON. And it's not an official thing.
No, there certainly are JSON things, but if you look on the ISO site, it says it's either ASN1 or XML.
Or the highway, I guess. They do give you that option too.
Them too, yes, that's exactly right.
They would rather you're walking on the highway so they can hit you with their truck, but that's okay.
Sure.
Sorry.
Thank you very much.
Guys.
I'd be delighted to come back and have this conversation again, because I do think that we will come around to it when we start planning for the MVP post the POC. So I'm looking forward to that discussion. I'm expecting it to be quite robust. Some of the non-functional requirements that we are starting to explore in the POC is around data provenance, privacy rights management, and user-based access and authorities, and user profile linked audit logging. So again, going from green to blue, we'll start building this into the architecture from the beginning in the POC, but we'll probably mature that in the MVP. Moving on to the rules engine. It is our intention to evaluate every transaction that we are getting, but again, because we control the flow of information coming into the POC, that's probably going to be easier than it might be in an MVP environment. So again, we're starting that process in the POC, but we'll fully mature our thinking around that for the MVP. We're going to be doing some rudimentary block list evaluation. So can this person transact? Is this person not allowed to transact? Is this person on a watch list that will then result in some sort of risk loading? Those are the kind of things that we're thinking for the POC. For the MVP, that will probably be a more full spectrum implementation of block list management. Fraud risk evaluation and AML evaluation, similarly, we have picked a number of typologies that we think we could use for the purposes of the POC. We'll be refining our thinking around those over the next week, and then we'll come back, and what we'd like to do is to have a workshop where we can discuss those with the community at large. Again, we'll be generating the alerts out of the system in the POC, but we're not yet expecting anybody to catch those alerts and then act on those alerts through some sort of workflow process or an internal workflow engine. That'll be an MVP issue. And we're doing the two kinds of rules evaluations. We're doing real-time rules evaluations, and then we're also doing near real-time rules evaluations. So they will be decision-making and switching within the rules engine to determine the priority of a specific set of rules for immediate evaluation, and then a lower priority for a set of rules that will then be near real-time evaluation after the transaction has concluded, potentially. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to be doing access to historical data, but we're not doing the access to prior evaluations. We're also not building a visual programming language interface into this yet. So that's a visual rules builder that we had intended and is specified in the BRD. But for the purposes of the MVP and the POC, our rules are probably going to be code-based and not VPL-based. We'll also be exploring a number of scripting options, but again, because we are doing a code-based implementation of the rules up front, and we're going to be using the tools that are available as part of the POC components, we don't yet know what the extensible scripting is going to look like. Extensible scripting will be a focus of the MVP, and then we'll be looking at this various kinds of scripting languages, and in particular, focusing on TypeScript and Java and Python, sorry, and JavaScript. Standard library of functions, this one calls quite, sorry, Miller.
Oh, sorry, quickly, the first stack there, you're talking about block list evaluation. Do please also consider an allow list. It's one of the tools that an administrator is going to need where your rules have simply gone haywire and they're preventing somebody from transacting and they need to be allowed. I would say then separately that once one has a block list and an allow list, that it would be nice if an administrator could make a time-based gesture in either of those lists. For the purposes of saying, look, I'll handle you for 15 minutes, but beyond that, I can't be bothered with this. So you're allowed for 15 minutes. Please go away. I got to get on to other things. But knowing they don't have to then go back and try to figure out how to remove somebody from an allow list, which is a dangerous action. And likewise on a block list where they've basically ruined someone's life and they've forgotten they've done that. So it would be nice to know that those sorts of things were considered. Clearly not part of the POC, but it's something that when you want maybe to consider as you start thinking about the component design, that there's something about the grooming of these lists that might have to go on in the background, and that might be then also administrator driven. Thanks.
I'm quite happy to say that we have a user story for that scenario, to have timed lists or temporary lists. So I'm very happy that we can do that. But we can also, yeah, thank you. And then we can accelerate that a little bit. So again, I'm going to not skip ahead too much, but hang in there. I have a question for you in a second. The library of functions caused some debate when we were evaluating the priorities for the POC. And the view was that it's too soon to focus on the best and most appropriate library of functions yet. It may even be too soon to do that for the MVP. And that's certainly something that has to be done at some point. But as we are going through a phase of discovery and exploration, we'll be collecting a large number of those libraries, but picking the one that we're going to go into production with, we won't be able to say just yet. And then the rest of the rules engine is mostly around change control and managing the topologies themselves. So in the POC, that will probably be more of a manual exercise, but we are going to be focusing on at least the audit logging component of that so that we could build that into the architecture right up front as part of the secure change management processes for the solution. And then finally, rule simulations as it exists there has two purposes. The first one is for automated testing, and the second one is for the investigations that a analyst might have to do. And those will both of those purposes will be fulfilled only in the MVP and not the POC. And then finally, just as a quick sneak preview of the case management features, these are the high level and very basic case management features that we envisaged. When we looked at the case management features and the requirements for a fraud risk management solution as part of Moduloop, we didn't find any requirements in there that were particularly complicated or complex. And it's one of the reasons why we decided not to focus on a case management solution by itself, because we suspect a large number of the case management solutions out there would probably be able to do the basics. And it's a very mature set of technologies by now, and they've been around for a while. So we were going to stop at API egress so that we can generate the alert that will go to a case management solution, but we're not putting a case management solution on the other end of that to catch the alert and the case. Next steps. So we are not going to be doing a planning session tomorrow. When we discussed it, we realized that there is far too much ground for us to cover responsibly and equitably in a 1 hour session with only maybe 1/10 of the community being able to attend. We decided that we would much rather defer to a community workshop a couple of weeks from now, and we're planning it for the 3rd of November at 1400 UTC. And as you can see, they were planning to do a 4-hour workshop with the community. And this will then constitute our PI planning. So what we are going to be aiming to deliver, and the outcome of that will then go onto the Miro board, maybe a little bit delayed compared to everybody else who will conclude those tomorrow. We're also going to groom our backlog specifically for the POC and get a sense from the community on what we should be putting into an MVP. I think this is a good opportunity for us to talk to people and find out what it is that the community really needs for that MVP, so that we are not making decisions on behalf of everybody ourselves. And then finally, we'll be looking at the sprint log prioritization so that we can kickstart the actual development that we are really excited about. We want to head into the development, and we want to know what our first couple of sprints are going to look like, and we'll be prioritizing our tickets for the sprint. In conjunction with that, for those sprints that we are, or the tickets we're prioritizing, the acceptance criteria. So acceptance criteria will have almost 2 levels to them. There's a acceptance criteria for a specific user story for the POC, and then there may be an extended set of acceptance criteria for the MVP ultimately. And we'd like to poll the community for those. So we're going to be doing a little bit of planning to prepare for that so that we have something to show. But we would love your participation then on the 3rd of November If you are able to make it and join us, then we can get this ball rolling. And then finally, we are targeting the POC delivery 3 months from now at the PI 12 convening or the PI 13 convening. So we're going to be spending our PI 12 on that. And that would be in January 2021. So we're looking forward to that. And thank you very much. That's it from me. I'm going to hand over to Greg, who's going to take us home. Miller?
Oh, just saying, very excited that January is going to be an exciting time. Whether we are in or out of quarantine at that point or lockdown, this is great. It's fantastic progress to see you guys making all this design work up front like this and structuring a program that actually understands we're in this for the long haul. It's a marathon, not a sprint. But that said, what is it, 6 sprints from now? We will see 6 around the track, and we'll actually see something. That's fantastic. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you, Miller.
Greg, all yours. Okay. So I have a question for everybody. Technically, isn't our time up? And if so, how long can I go? How much do you want me to speed this up?
Yeah, we're technically at the end of this session, but I'll try to give you 10 minutes maybe, but if you can save some time.
I'll move it. Just we'll have to see if there's some questions out of this. So my name's Greg McCormick. A lot of you know me, Chief Strategic Business Development Officer at Cybrin. It's a big title that kind of puts me in the middle of a lot of different things. But I get to play with technology and I get to figure out how things go to market. So it makes me pretty happy. I'm going to talk briefly about the architectural goals, some of the targets that we're going to try to do, what the POC architecture is going to look like, general, the data pipeline, the rules engine, case management, and a couple of closing questions. Going to keep this really high level to a degree, right? This is brand new. If you ask us a lot of questions, we're going to tell you we don't know yet, right? We're just getting started on this. So the goals are we're going to leverage existing deployments and design patterns of fraud services, fraud management services, and we're going to update them to use open source components. The outcome, if you will, is that with proper effort, a zero cost solution can be implemented by any organization with the right skills. Now that's still going to be a tall order for somebody to do, but it should be something that someone can do. And we need to be able to keep it affordable, reliable, and also accountable. It needs to produce what it's supposed to produce. We are looking at this more like this is a special interest group, meaning it's not an adjunct directly to Mojaloop. It certainly is involved in Mojaloop, but we need to be mindful of other platforms because for one, people are going to be using other platforms at the same time they're using Mojaloop. And two, we're going to get a broader reach with this by taking that approach and therefore facilitate the level 1 principle with that. We're going to also stress the fact that this is to be code-based. So no UX, certainly not any UX right now. The intention is that we're building something that others can innovate around it. So normally we'd be talking about visual rules engines and things like that. We're actually not going to be looking at those. We're going to be looking at rules engines that we can give you a structure to connect to. Architectural goals, innovate, right? So we want to innovate. But the key innovations are going to be via open source. And we're going to be trying to identify the best practices, affordable means to do this, different ways to ease the integration, because there's a lot of integration with systems like this, and how to optimize the effectiveness of the system. But notice there's a big knot in the symbol in the lower left-hand corner. I want to stress this is not an initiative to do the latest, greatest AI and machine learning thing or the best and most earth-shattering, awesome algorithms that are state of the art. That is really not the goal here. This is going to be good and frankly best of breed. It will be fast, it will be adaptable, and it will be a framework that everybody can build on. So other people that want to spend time doing those other things, can do that. Now, that said, of course, if we spot things that we see and stuff like that along the way, we're going to do that. And as long as we aren't breaking the level 1 principle by doing so, and as long as we're producing a system that's low cost and we're being effective in how we're building this thing, we will look at stuff like that. But it's definitely not a priority, and that's something that we want to keep in everybody's head. So I pulled this back to the major items from Justice's slides, and I wanted to put in other goals, right? So that is low response time. So we're aiming at a 35 millisecond turnaround time on a total decision process, so that we don't impact the high volumes and transfers that we all want to be doing with Moduloop at 3000 TPS. We want the false positive rate to be below 10% or in the single digits, and we want the true positives to catch 95% or better. And notice what I'm saying there is of known typologies. We're not going to be saying we're making some super adaptable system that can follow rules and learn and be above, say, 80% and things like that. That's a separate type of thing. We're not going to go there. All of this would be hard to do even if we had unlimited resources, tons of funding. We were using all the best of breed, highly tuned 4-cell products, right? But the reality is, if we just got to pick the right tools, the right design, and keep in mind that we're doing this open source, right? So we're picking those right products and we're picking those right concepts, and we still should be able to do this, but this is definitely a new thing. As a general architecture, clearly there's an application framework, and inside that there's a data layer, an orchestration layer, there's an eventing system on it. I'm not trying to get fancy here with this at all. On the data layer, we've got to be worried about persistence, because we're already hearing everything from what Justice is talking about, that data is king, there's a lot going on. We're hearing about caching in this discussion and in many other discussions being important to performance. Caching is critical to performance on a real-time fraud response. On top of that, the ETL, the data extraction, or transforming and aggregating data and pre-prepping it to be available for use by the cache is also critical. So those are very, very important components. Then there's an orchestration layer. We're not even really sure that we need a workflow or some sort of BPMN layer in there for what we're doing. Maybe that all lives outside of this inside case management, because really maybe what we're worried about is microflows and the rules, which absolutely have to exist. So DMN, digital modeling notation, works for certain type of rules relatively slow. There's a lot of different rule scenarios. Basically, the other component would be predicate or queries. So what are where clauses? What can we do that is simply greater than or equal to, and things along those lines, which are incredibly fast. And then sitting on top of that, you've got the connectors to all the various systems, the case management that wraps all around this and puts it together, and the reports that need to be getting generated both for internal use and external use. But I want to make sure we stress this other side, and hopefully by the time we're done here, we will have stressed this an awful lot, and that is there has to be governance wrapped all around this, all right? Everything we do, from changing a rule to changing a limit, needs to be tracked and managed so that we know what's going on and why maybe something that shouldn't have gone through at some point in time did in fact get through. Everything related to personal information, all the anonymization, everything else needs to be dealt with. What were the sources? All that needs to be dealt with. And we're going to really need to spend a lot of focus on this, thinking through all the questions that just came up earlier. What do we keep? What don't we keep? What's in our domain of responsibility? What's not, etc. So the reality is it might look something like this, right? So this is a slide that I threw together a while back. Some of you have seen it. And I just threw together a basic wrapper app in Dino or Node and said, obviously, we have user and admin components and case and dashboards and an investigation wrapper, something to send off alerts to the case management system. And that's going to be in JavaScript or TypeScript. And then you have this orchestration and rules layer. We could use a product like Flowable, something I've worked with that happens to have all three of those components in there and is well used. And a database to store all the local system, MySQL or something like that. We could even throw in something like Neo4j Bloom, which could do the visualization on for the investigation side. So large graph database analysis with a nice visual tool. And then down below that, there's NiFi, which in this case is representing an ETL layer. Databases, Cassandra, Mongo, and then a cache. You've got to have that. So if we kind of start to go through this list, We already know that everybody wants to do TypeScript and JavaScript, so clearly a yes. Deno or Node, sure, either one. We're thinking we want to focus on Deno. You know, and the rest, well, there's a lot of different options. And we put some on here, and we put, frankly, the main ones that we're wanting to look at right now. And we know the community will have an opinion on something like this, because let's face it, we're all technologists. We've got opinions on things like this, and we're going to have to wade through this. So Apache Cassandra, for example, very, very fast database at the center of lots of different things. Tinkerpop, how's that for a name? That's really Gremlin. That's a graph database layer, and graph database query language is really what we're looking to get out of that. Druid, another very fast database system. Apache Spark, one that has the machine learning components and a graph database built into it. So we have to work through these and try to find out which ones probably make the most sense. And then there's the ETL tool side. We look at Talon and Tahoe and NiFi and Tremor, all of which, if you look at them, there is a little bit of overlap of so many of these products now. I've had a lot of people ask me why NiFi, because they see that it can do streaming stuff. They see that it can connect to HTTP endpoints and the like. That's absolutely not what, at least I'm interested in NiFi for. I'm interested in it as a data movement tool, as a data aggregation tool. It has built-in data provenance layers, so it can help with all of the data governance aspects. Just tons of flexibility there built in, and would get rid of an awful lot of work that you would probably have to build with some of these other systems. Caching, I'm really used to using Redis. We use Redis and Mojaloop on a lot of things. We use Redis and Cybrin on a lot of things. Miller the other day brought up Apache Arrow, and we looked at it, and yeah, it looks pretty slick as well and very fast. Rules engines, I didn't even know what to put down here because it's many. We can do quite a bit of different things. Scripting, you know, your Python, JavaScript, R, frankly, because there's a lot of statistical work. Those are things that need to be focused on embedding first. And then all the modular libraries for statistics and different types of math and things like that. But really, what I wanted to say here is that there's a lot of interchangeable options. We don't have to pick necessarily anything right now. We need to pick the things that make the most sense, test them, prototype, learn, and find what the right solutions are going to be in the end. This is a POC. That's what we're doing. So if I put justices...
Before you proceed, I just want to make one caution statement, which is that on the platform choices, yeah, TypeScript, JavaScript, sure. We've been saying as part of a DA that we're moving towards TypeScript for some reasons that the DA can explore in more detail in another session. However, as far as Deno or Node, not Deno. Okay. We've already selected a platform, and where we are right now is that introducing another platform with its own package manager and its own set of module requirements would simply be too distracting for the potential benefits that might accrue to the developers. You know, I hate to say it, but developers are expected to inhale pain, whereas the end users and deployers shouldn't have to. So TypeScript's another matter altogether, because it really does make the code safer. Deno doesn't do that. They both use the V8 Java script engine. So I would have said for now, let's stick to Node rather than wasting time during the POC evaluating whether one is better than the other. I don't think it gets you to your goal. But we could have a separate discussion about that, you know, more openly within the community. I just say that for the time being anyway, we've made certain choices that are fairly solid, I think, at the DA level. Okay.
All right, fair enough. Yeah, I don't know how much we were really going to test between the two of those either. Kind of, as you say, half a dozen, one versus the other, but yeah, if you've already committed. So I duplicated Justice's slide here and just threw in a little blurb that said, it's all about the data. If the data isn't right, we just can't do this. I mean, it isn't any more simple than that. So we've got to be worried about the management of it, the transformation of it, the aggregation of it, the caching of it, and the governance. What should we have, when and where? What should be anonymized? There's a lot. If you look at this screen, and this is what I want everybody to look at, this is the busiest slide in here. So it's one of the areas that's going to need, the most focus, and we tend to not necessarily think of that. So I want to keep that in everybody's mind. On the rules engine side of thing, so fit for purpose, speed when needed, right? Some of these near real-time things that require multiple data sources and maybe would be benefiting from some sort of a graph query or something like that. It's not something that we're going to run and we're going to process a result back in 35 milliseconds. So depending on what it is and the complexity, decision modeling notation might be perfect to use, right? Whereas it may be that a lot of these real-time rules, we actually use something that's just predicate or where clauses or really database specific because it cuts down on a lot of overhead. So it needs to be highly configurable and flexible, again, where needed. Version control. This is an area where where people get in trouble is they don't have version control of what change was made, when and why, and even if it's just a limit. Why did we suddenly start letting fraud come through? Someone changed the limit from 300 to 350. All the scripting libraries, etc. So we're not looking at doing with this, implementing some big AI or ML component with this. Certainly not for right now. There's a lot of complexity around doing stuff like that, and there's also, it feels like most of the things that are being called AI and ML right now in the market are really things that are leveraging components of AI and ML to really bring up different data sets or points or do some pre-calculations and determinations. And then you still got really, really complex rule sets running these things. So we're going to push stuff like that to the back burner, and we're going to stick with basic rules engines. And more importantly, should there be just one? So we don't think there should be just one. We think we should be using rules engines that are fit for purpose. And so we have a design in mind that will quite easily do that. That is probably the most interesting thing that I think we've come up with. We're evaluating 7 right now, and we're going to always be looking for more here. Again, on the case management, as Justice said, there is just a ton of this in the market already. I mean, you can buy it from Cybrin if you want to. We certainly have it. We have a commercial version. There's lots of open source versions. You can buy it from IBM OpenText or any number of other places, right? And they're all good products. So other than managing the ingress and the egress of what's going on, how do we trigger the cases and things like that, there's probably not a lot to do there other than making sure they've got the key components. This last slide, in conclusion, so hopefully you got more answers than questions. Justice, did you flip that around on me? That was supposed to be, hopefully you have more questions than answers. I wanted people thinking there. So I think he thought I made a mistake on that on the first one. The idea being that this is a proof of concept, right? So we're trying to prove concepts. That's the real first goal here. So we want to be evoking thought. We want to be evoking testing the right things. We've got a mission, a goal, good technology to choose from, a lot of experience, and we have a Miller. We're pretty comfortable with that. So so we're all pretty excited about this. Questions, answers, and sorry for going long.